class, it's me. I'm back, Dr. White. I am going to do a brief overview of Chapter 1 and things I want you to be thinking about this week. So typically I'm going to do an overview each week of the chapters, but I'm not one to sit and go over a PowerPoint with you or to read the text to you. I feel like you're a master's level student. You should already be reading the text and having the information. Although I do want to highlight a few of the key points and just give a little bit of input on some of the key areas throughout the chapter. So for week 1, you are reading chapter 1, obviously, which basically just kind of gives you an introduction to multicultural and social justice counseling from the perspective of the authors of this particular book. Now, this book is outlined a little differently than what I think some students expect for a multicultural counseling course. I have had students think in the past that they're going to come into this course and they're going to learn about different cultures, like I'm going to learn about what Native Americans do and what East Asians do and what African Americans do. And that's not really how this course is set up, or really any counseling course at this point. So yes, you are going to learn some general information about different populations, more from assignments, but this book is set up to talk about what is multicultural counseling and what does that kind of mean overall, and how do we incorporate that into the counseling profession. So this week, I'm sorry, I was looking at my notes. What the book talks about is 1, the importance of multicultural counseling and social justice. 2 is acculturation. 3 is how counseling is political. And like I talked about in the introduction, that can get a little uncomfortable for people sometimes. 4 is the MSJCC. And then 5 is how we as counselors are advocates. So with the first component, with why is multicultural counseling and social justice important, I think a lot of that is self-explanatory at this point. But some people still say, like, maybe I live in rural Tennessee and I'm just going to treat people who are kind of like me. And my argument to that is everybody is multicultural, and we need to start thinking about culture from a really broad concept. So sometimes people think about culture and they think of it as maybe just age or race or gender. But I am a believer in, well, there's 2 different models. There's the addressing framework and the respectful framework, and they're kind of frameworks that will give you it gives you different letters, like addressing is ADDRESSING and respectful likewise, and gives you different areas that you can look at to kind of think of a person overall or more globally as part of their culture. And I would say that everything that we think, do, believe, etc. comes from a cultural lens. Like, I think in a particular way because I was born in America, because I speak English, because I am a white woman, because I am 45 years old. All of those concepts, or all of those components of me, impact how I think. As a 45-year-old, I'm going to think differently than my 86-year-old grandmother. I'm going to think differently than my 10-year-old daughter. I'm going to think differently than my 3-year-old granddaughter. So age is a huge cultural factor that impacts all of those different aspects. As a woman, I might have more opportunities at certain jobs or less opportunity at other jobs. I am going to possibly have pressure to have kids by a certain age, be married by a certain age, etc. Now, that could be part of being American, that could be part of being a woman, that could be part of being my age. You're seeing how all of these different cultural components come together. The other thing is, sometimes when I ask students to share, tell me a cultural experience, they're like, I don't really have any. Every experience you have is cultural. Even if you think that you are cultureless, I would argue absolutely not. And all the components of your culture are just as important as components of other cultures. So sometimes I have students in class who haven't done a lot of traveling, maybe don't have a lot of experience with people who are different than themselves, and they feel like, I don't really know a whole lot about culture. Well, you do, it's just maybe limited or different knowledge than what somebody else would have. So for instance, I've done a considerable amount of traveling. I've lived in Europe. I have taught this class for a long time, so I'm going to have different experiences and a different knowledge set than somebody who lives in southeast Kentucky in a rural area. Doesn't mean they don't have culture, doesn't mean they don't have knowledge and understanding and are very educated about certain components of culture. Maybe they know more about the Appalachian culture than what I would know. So everybody has experience in this area, and it is important because how are we going to relate to other people if we don't understand how they think, believe, and behave? And if our culture dictates all of those things, then we need to understand culture in general, not only our own, but the cultures of other people. And then you have the social justice component. And this word, I think, sometimes can be misunderstood. So with social justice, it is talking about equality and rights and equity and how we ensure that clients are having that, because we know that there are a lot of groups of people who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who experience discrimination, and a lot of times those clients might not have a voice for their self. It might be somebody that we have to advocate for or a group that we have to advocate for. So that brings in this huge component of advocacy and social justice to the counseling field, which we'll talk more about next week when we talk about the history of counseling and how counseling essentially came from advocacy. Now, the next topic is acculturation, and acculturation is what you'll read about. There's different acculturation models, different levels of acculturation, but essentially, when we're talking about it just as an overview, it's saying that why should any one person have to change their culture to act like another culture? So sometimes you will hear people say, if you're in America, you should speak English, or if you are in, I don't know, you should eat this type of food, you should wear these type of clothes, etc. But why should any one person have to give up part of their culture to go for the dominant culture? So that talks a little bit about what acculturation is, and because it's devaluing, when you're telling somebody to change their culture to go for the dominant culture, it is devaluing the components of their culture and kind of what that means to a person. So we'll talk about this more when we study immigrant populations and the different acculturation levels that people go through and how that can cause different levels of stress and trauma for clients as well. But acculturation is something that we need to be aware of because all of us also have acculturation experiences. Sometimes we think of it as just being immigrants, but if you live in rural Tennessee, let's say Tullahoma, and you decide, you lived in such a rural community that you only had one school and it was K through 12. And so you basically know everybody you grew up with, but then you decide you're going to go to Ohio State University for university. Well, obviously you're going to be in Columbus, Ohio, which is going to be different. It's going to be a big city. You're not going to know anyone. You're going to have all kind of new exposure to new things. It's going to be a completely different culture. So a lot of your older culture will come with you, but you'll also take on components of your new culture, and some stuff is going to change because you're going to acculturate to that new culture. And I mean, we can think of this in a very small sense to every time we go into a new class with a new teacher, we have to acculturate to kind of what that teacher expects of us. So those are things you can start to think about. Acculturation is a component of one of your upcoming assignments, so make sure that you are reading that section. Next section is counseling is political. Oh, this can make people nervous, but I will say 100%. I believe this will become more apparent when you read about the history of counseling and how we became a profession, but also just thinking about how politics and laws affect people. Whether you're allowed to get married, whether you're allowed to live in a particular location, how long you're allowed to live in a location, what language you speak, what is accepted. All of these things are dictated by law, which is politics. And we have clients who are impacted by this, whether it doesn't matter which side of the continuum you're on or what side of the continuum you believe. it is going to impact you whether certain laws are passed or not. Are you allowed to talk about abortion with your clients? Are you allowed to work with clients who have immigrated to the United States illegally? Certain things like that, and how that impacts our clients is all going to be driven by the political system. So part of your book starts talking about that in chapter 1. It also talks about privilege and oppression and discrimination, and each of those topics are going to be in one of your first assignments as well. So making sure that you really understand what privilege is, whether it's white privilege or Christian privilege or English language privilege, etc. And thinking about what privilege is essentially not saying that a person hasn't had any struggles. So if, for instance, we're talking about white privilege for myself, I have white privilege just because I was born white. That doesn't mean I haven't struggled. That doesn't mean I haven't lived on food stamps or in poverty or grew up in a household with alcoholism and all of the other struggles, but it does mean that my whiteness was not one of my struggles. It does take down certain barriers. It means I'm not followed in stores because I'm white. It means I'm not targeted for being in certain parts of town or for driving a certain car, or people don't lock their doors or grab their purses when I'm around, because there's just this automatic trust, one, that I'm a female, two, that I'm white, and it's something that I didn't earn. It was just something I was born into. Doesn't mean I didn't have struggles, but it means that my whiteness was not one of my struggles. So when you're thinking about privilege, start thinking about those sorts of components and what areas you hold privilege in versus what areas you are don't hold privilege in. Next part is on, I'm going to open the book, is on page 7 in your book. It's the MSCC. And this is explained, it's just kind of an introduction to what are the domains of multicultural counseling. And it talks about specifically counseling awareness. So you have to have awareness of yourself, awareness of the client's worldview. So how does the client see the world, and how does the client interact in the world? The counseling relationship. So what is the relationship between you and your own awareness and your own cultural components and that of the clients and the client worldview? How does that relationship work out? And then the fourth piece is counseling advocacy. Now that starts on page 6, but goes into depth on page 7, and then kind of breaks it down even further on page 8. So I want you to pay particular attention to those pages, because this outlines what we will be doing in this course. So one of your first assignments will be to do a kind of like self-assessment and to think about your areas of culture and your areas of wellness and how those are impacted. And so that's where we're getting to learn a lot about ourselves. Then the next assignment is to talk about self and others. So how does being white impact my interaction with other people? Well, it might improve my interaction with other white females because they might think, oh, she understands or she relates to me. Maybe if it was a Muslim man, maybe he wouldn't feel comfortable coming to me because I'm a female and he's not supposed to discuss certain things with a female. So that's going to impact my interaction. So just me being a female can have two different impacts of that relationship depending on who that client is. Same with my age. Maybe working with a 10-year-old, he'll think, oh, you're old, you don't understand. Maybe working with an 80-year-old, she'll think, oh, you're too young, you don't understand. So I'm the same age. My cultural identity didn't change as far as my age goes, but how it's perceived by other people. And that goes from like, what is the client's worldview? What do they believe? And how do they interact with me, which is the third component of that counseling relationship. So it gives you more information about that on page 7. And then it really breaks it down into what are we doing when we are multiculturally competent counselors. And this talks about what are we learning about. We're learning about the attitudes and beliefs of ourself and of the client. So what are our own attitudes and beliefs? What do I believe about age? What do I believe about disability? What do I believe about nationality and indigenous heritage, gender, geographical location, all of the different components that make up who I am culturally? And what do I believe about others who might be similar or different than myself? What are some of my values? Do I value hard work? Do I value independence? Do I value working with others in collaboration or competition? Do I value a higher power, etc.? All of these beliefs and attitudes that make us up, but also make up the clients, that could be very similar in some ways and different in other ways. Next is knowledge. So one of the things we're going to be talking about in this class is knowledge of others. So that's like greater knowledge of a cultural group, or that can be knowledge to understand different concepts, like what does critical race theory really mean? What is oppression? What is discrimination? What is power and privilege? And what are those concepts and how are they impacting other people? Next is skills. So I might have all the book knowledge. Say I read a whole book and I feel like I know everything about the Asian culture, which we know is not even possible because there are hundreds of different Asian cultures and you're not going to learn everything from a book. And I might feel like, okay, I've done a lot of work on myself and I feel like I understand my own attitudes and beliefs. But how do I apply that information? And that's where it comes to the skills. So am I going to use reality therapy that was developed by Glasser, a white male, middle age, I guess, when he developed it? Is that going to work for all of my clients? How am I going to apply my counseling skills so that they actually work for diverse clientele? And then the final is action. Okay, I might learn the skills and I might learn different techniques. Maybe I'm going to use narrative therapy with African American client because the research shows that works. But how do I actually take action? Whether that's social justice action, advocacy action, or just putting those skills into action so that I'm treating clients in the best way possible. So that's kind of an overview of the important components of this chapter. Like I said, some people might feel like that's a little provocative, talking about critical race theory and privilege and oppression. I ask that you sit with that, read it with an open mind. I'm not asking that you agree with it. I'm just asking that you read it and sit and think about how these topics are not only impacting us, but also impacting clients. And we have a vast variety of clientele, everything from active duty military to immigrants to asylum seekers to geriatric population, infant population who suffered abuse. I mean, there's so many different clientele out there. We can only touch such a little component in one class. I feel like hopefully this is being incorporated in all of your courses, and that this course will just really get down to some of those key concepts that we need to understand about multicultural counseling. I hope you have a great week and enjoy your reading, and I'll see you next week. Bye.